The night was dark and heavy, a silence so thick it could choke you. In the small village of La Guardia, nestled in the hills of Montserrat, a woman's shrill voice shattered the calm. Maria, a local villager, refused to accept the kiss of peace at Mass, and instead she made a scene. Her neighbors stared in shock as she spat out words that sounded like blasphemy. May the devil take this church and all who serve it. The villagers, fearing the wrath of the Inquisition, quickly penned down their accounts and sent them to the Holy Office. Within weeks, the inquisitors arrived, their presence a cold wind that sent shivers down everyone's spine. The inquisitors, cloaked in their black robes, asked Maria if she knew her basic prayers. She stuttered, her hands trembling as she recited the Lord's Prayer. The inquisitors, it seemed, were not interested in her words, but in the chaos she had caused. They reprimanded her, but nothing more. The village breathed a sigh of relief, but the fear lingered, a shadow that would not lift. This was not an isolated incident. In the early 17th century, Catalonia was a hotbed of private feuds disguised as religious zeal. The Inquisition, with its vast powers, became a tool for personal vendettas. In 1607, in the bustling city of Barcelona, a young wife named Juana found herself in a heated argument with her husband, a skilled silversmith. In a moment of rage, she denounced him and his mother to the Inquisition. The silversmith's neighbor, a house painter named Juan, protested. If she were a good wife, she wouldn't have accused her husband and mother-in-law to the Inquisition. But Juana was quick to retort. If the accusations were not true, the Inquisition would punish the accuser. Juan, feeling the weight of her words, replied, "They do favors for everybody." His words, a simple protest, earned him a small fine for doubting the inquisitor's impartiality. The silversmith, despite his threats of violence, received only a stern warning. The inquisitors, it seemed, did not wish to delve into the petty quarrels of the community. They had more pressing matters to attend to, or so it appeared, but the damage was done. The fear of denunciation, of neighbors turning on each other, had taken root. Conversations in the market, whispers in the church, all carried the potential to be a trap. The Inquisition, once a feared and respected institution, had become a pawn in the hands of those who sought to settle scores. In St. Pierre Pescador, a small town in Girona, a trader named Pedro found himself in a heated argument with an employee of the Holy Office. In a fit of anger, Pedro fired a gun at the man. The inquisitors, upon hearing the case, did not see it as an act of heresy, but as a result of a long-standing feud. The quarrel, they concluded, was born out of conflicts the two had had a long time ago. The inquisitors, it seemed, were not always the relentless hunters of heresy they were made out to be. They were often more concerned with the moral and social conduct of the people they oversaw. The system of justice in 17th century Spain relied heavily on the public. Neighbors, parishioners, and even enemies were the ones who provided the evidence that could send a person to their doom. The fear of these informers was often more terrifying than the Inquisition itself. In 1490, a converso named Manuel Rodriguez, who had fled Andalusia to escape the wrath of his neighbors, was described as pale and dead with fright in the city of Soria. The fear of being denounced, of being betrayed by those he thought were friends, was a constant weight on his shoulders. The denunciation process was not unique to the Inquisition. It had roots in the Roman Empire and was a common feature in the judicial systems of all European countries. The Catholic Church, in particular, had developed a system where denunciation was not only a means of reformation, but also a way to punish the guilty. The inquisitors, when they received a denunciation, would conduct an inquiry to gather factual evidence. But the evidence, more often than not, was based on hearsay and suspicion. The inquisitors relied heavily on informers, many of whom stood to gain from the accusations they made. The practice of using informers was so widespread that it even drew protests in the courts, the Spanish Parliament. Juan de Mariana, a prominent historian, noted that people felt deprived of the liberty to speak freely, as there were always informers ready to report any misstep. In the communities of Jews and conversos, the fear of denunciation was even more pronounced. Sermons and public exhortations encouraged people to denounce both themselves and others, leading to a climate of suspicion and betrayal. In 1678, the Chuita community in Mallorca, a group of conversos, faced a tragedy that saw many of their members turn against each other. The once strong resistance to persecution crumbled, leading to a wave of betrayals and terror. Even in more mundane cases, the fear of denunciation was a constant presence. In 1530, Aldonca de Vargas, a woman in the Canary Islands, was reported to the Inquisition for smiling when she heard the name of the Virgin Mary. The motive of her accuser remains a mystery, but the consequences were clear. In 1635, a Frenchman named Pedro Ginesta, over 80 years old, was brought before the tribunal for eating bacon on a day of abstinence. The accusation, based on suspicion, led to a presumption of guilt and a trial that could have ended in disaster. The Inquisition, therefore, became a tool for settling old scores. Petty denunciations were the rule rather than the exception. In 1560, when the Lutheran crisis hit Seville, a stream of people turned up at the Inquisition's offices, each with a tale to tell. One informant later admitted that he had fabricated accusations out of sheer malice. The fear of being denounced was so great that some people chose to denounce themselves, hoping to avoid the worst. In 1530, Alonso de Yin was prosecuted for urinating against the walls of a church, and in 1581, 2 husbands confessed to their wives that they had claimed fornication was not a sin. The fear of being denounced by their wives was a powerful motivator. The inquisitors, despite their reputation for severity, were not always blind to the truth. In 1637, when Felipe Leonard, a French needlemaker living in Tarragona, was denounced by his entire family for Lutheranism, the tribunal quickly realized the charges were motivated by malice and suspended the trial. The fear of denunciation, however, often led to innocent people being caught in a web of lies. The consequences could be severe, as seen in the case of Enrique Jorge Henriques, a physician to the Duke of Alba. After his death in 1622, secret witnesses claimed his body had been buried according to Jewish rites. The result was that his entire family was imprisoned for 2 years before being acquitted for lack of evidence. The system of anonymity in the Inquisition, where the names of witnesses were kept secret, was a double-edged sword. It protected witnesses from retaliation, but also made it easy for malice to thrive. The practice of concealing names was opposed in the courts, but the influence of the inquisitors, particularly Cardinal Cisneros, ensured that it remained in place. The fear of denunciation, the constant presence of informers, and the power of the Inquisition created a society where trust was a rare commodity. The Inquisition, in its early years, had been a force that sought to root out heresy and maintain the purity of the faith. But as the years passed, it became something else, a tool for the powerful, a weapon for the vengeful, and a source of fear for the innocent. The stories of Maria, Juana, and Pedro, and countless others, are a testament to the dark side of a system that was meant to protect the faith, but often did the exact opposite. In the shadows of the Inquisition, the true face of human nature was revealed, and it was not always a pretty sight. In the early years of the Inquisition, the Church used a special document called an Edict of Grace to catch people who might be guilty of heresy. This edict was a bit like a medieval version of a police amnesty. It listed various heresies, mostly Jewish or Muslim practices, and invited people to come forward and admit their mistakes. If they did so within a set period, usually around a month, they would be forgiven and not face harsh punishments. This approach worked surprisingly well. In Mallorca, for example, 337 conversos people who had converted from Judaism to Christianity denounced themselves. In Seville, the prisons filled up quickly with people who came forward. By the 1500s, these edicts of grace had served their purpose and were replaced by edicts of faith. These new edicts didn't offer a period of grace, but instead encouraged people to report others who were guilty of specific heresies. However, when the Inquisition turned its attention to the Moriscos Muslims who had converted to Christianity, they brought back the Edicts of Grace to gather more information. In 1568, an edict in Valencia led to 2,689 Moriscos denouncing themselves. Some Moriscos even asked for edicts of grace to distance themselves from more radical groups. Over time, the list of heresies in the edicts grew longer. By the 1600s, the edicts included not just Jewish and Muslim practices, but also heresies related to Lutheranism, superstitions, and other moral offenses. These detailed documents could take over an hour to read from the pulpit, but most people probably didn't pay much attention. Many of the offenses listed were not relevant to the daily lives of most Spaniards, so the congregations were likely bored or confused. Before someone could be arrested, the evidence against them had to be reviewed by theologians, who acted as consultants to determine if the charges involved heresy. If the evidence was strong enough, the prosecutor would request the arrest. However, sometimes arrests happened before all the evidence was collected, leading to people being imprisoned without a solid case against them. This caused problems like the case in Valladolid in 1699, where several suspects, including a young girl and boy, were held for up to 2 years without a proper review of the evidence. When someone was arrested, their property was immediately seized. An inventory was made of everything they owned, from pots and pans to old clothes, and all of it was held by the Inquisition until the case was decided. This could be a significant hardship for the family, as they might lose their home and means of income. In 1486, King Ferdinand ordered the Inquisition to support the children of an accused man, but it wasn't until 1561 that this became a formal rule. Even then, there were cases of dishonest officials misusing the property, or of trials dragging on for years. The arrested person was usually taken to the Inquisition's secret prison, a private section of the Inquisition building. These prisons were often in better condition than other prisons, sometimes even in fortified castles. In some cases, prisoners preferred the Inquisition's prisons to others. For example, a friar in Valladolid in 1629 made heretical statements just to be transferred to the Inquisition's prison, and a priest in 1675 pretended to be a Judaizer for the same reason. However, not all inquisitorial prisons were humane. The tribunal in Lorena had a small, old, and poorly maintained building that couldn't handle the number of prisoners. In Logrono, the prison conditions were so bad that during a hot summer, over 20 prisoners died in their cells. A prisoner in Lisbon in 1802 described his cell as a small, damp room with a straw mattress, a water pot, and a chamber pot that was only emptied every 8 days. The cell was cold in winter and damp, making it an uncomfortable place to live for nearly 3 years. Despite these harsh conditions, the Inquisition did make efforts to treat prisoners reasonably. They were fed regularly with bread, meat, and wine, and some prisoners could even order extra supplies like oil, vinegar, and chocolate. Paupers were given basic necessities like slippers and shirts, and some prisoners were allowed to have writing materials. However, prisoners were usually isolated from the outside world and from each other. Overcrowding was common, and prisoners were not allowed to attend Mass or receive the sacraments. This isolation and lack of spiritual comfort were often very hard on the prisoners. Some prisoners, like the English sailor John Hill, complained of poor conditions, such as sleeping on the floor with fleas and lacking food and water. The Inquisition used tools like the mordaza, a gag to prevent prisoners from talking or blaspheming, and the pie de amigo, an iron fork to keep their heads upright. Despite these measures, the Inquisition's prisons were generally considered better than other prisons of the time. Despite efforts to be humane, the conditions in the Inquisition's prisons still led to deaths, often from disease and poor health. In 1699, a seamstress and her 4 sons were imprisoned on suspicion of Judaizing. Within 6 months, 2 of her sons died in the hospital, a tragic consequence of the Inquisition's practices. In the world of the Inquisition, the way they handled suspects was quite different from what we might imagine today. When someone was accused of a crime, especially heresy, they would often face a formal interrogation. This wasn't just a casual conversation. It was a serious and structured process. The room would usually have a secretary taking notes of everything said, and a notary to ensure everything was done correctly. The inquisitors, the people asking the questions, had a lot of experience and knew how to get information from people. For minor offenses, like breaking small rules, the process wasn't as intense. But for serious crimes like heresy, the inquisitors had to be much more careful. They had manuals written by experts like Bernard Gui and Nicolau Aymeric that taught them how to deal with people who might try to hide the truth. For example, these manuals explained that heretics might try to change the subject, pretend to be sick, or act stupid to avoid answering. The inquisitors had to be smart and persistent to get the truth. In some places, like Languedoc, the inquisitors would isolate the accused to make them feel more vulnerable. They also had special tricks to get people to talk without needing to use harsh methods. But sometimes these tricks didn't work, and they had to use torture. Torture was a practice they inherited from the medieval Inquisition, and it was allowed by the rules, but it had to be used carefully. The inquisitors had to follow strict guidelines, and they could only use it if they had a good reason. The idea behind torture wasn't to punish the person, but to get them to confess. After being tortured, the accused had to repeat their confession the next day to make sure it was real. If they refused, the inquisitors could threaten to continue the torture. Sometimes, people were even tortured to make them reveal information about others. Torture wasn't used all the time. In the early years, it was rare because other methods, like witness testimony, were enough to get convictions. But as time went on, especially in the 1530s, the inquisitors started using it more often, especially in places like Valencia, where they were trying to find hidden Jews. By the 1600s, a lot of people accused of being secret Jews were tortured. In some cases, like in Toledo, only about a third of the accused were tortured, but in others, like in Seville, it was closer to half. The methods of torture were not unique to the Inquisition. Other courts used similar techniques. The three main types were the garrocha, the toca, and the patro. The garrocha involved hanging the person by their wrists and dropping them suddenly to stretch their limbs. The toca was a water torture where the person was forced to drink water until they were in great pain. The patro was a rack that tightened cords around the body, causing intense pain. All of these methods were designed to get the person to confess without causing permanent damage. Even though torture was supposed to be used carefully, it could be very brutal. People of all ages, including the very old and very young, could be subjected to it. Some people were left with broken limbs or even died from the torture. The inquisitors would record every detail of the torture, which gives us a glimpse into how terrible it could be. For example, in 1568, a woman accused of not eating pork and changing her linen on Saturdays was put on the rack. She begged for mercy and admitted to everything the witnesses said, just to stop the pain. Another case involved a young sailor named Jacob Peterson, who was tortured until he confessed. Despite the brutality, the Inquisition was not always the most cruel. Civil courts in Spain and other parts of Europe often used similar methods, but with even more cruelty. The Inquisition tried to follow rules and sometimes even showed mercy, especially if it was clear that someone was innocent. One of the hardest parts of being accused was not knowing why you were arrested. The inquisitors would give the accused 3 warnings to confess, but they wouldn't say what they were accused of. This could be very confusing and scary, especially for someone who was innocent. If the accused didn't confess, they would finally hear the charges, but they had to answer right away without any time to prepare or get help from a lawyer. The accused could have a lawyer, but this wasn't always helpful. At first, they could choose their own lawyer, but later, the inquisitors picked the lawyers, who were often more loyal to the Inquisition than to their clients. Some lawyers did their best to help, but it was a difficult and risky job. The Inquisition was a complex and often harsh system, but it was also part of a larger context where torture and strict laws were common. Understanding how it worked helps us see the challenges people faced, and the ways in which they tried to survive in a world where trust and freedom were not always guaranteed. When a prisoner was finally accused, they were given a document that supposedly contained all the evidence against them. This was meant to help them prepare their defense, but it often wasn't as helpful as it seemed. The names of all witnesses were kept secret, and any details that might help identify them were removed. This meant the prisoner often didn't know the full story of what they were accused of. The inquisitors could use information that the prisoner had never seen, which made it hard to defend against the charges. At first, the Inquisition wasn't sure how to handle this. But in 1561, a man named Valdez wrote a set of instructions. These said that any evidence that might reveal a witness's identity could be left out. Only the evidence in the document could be used in the case. This rule made the process look more fair, but it often made it harder for the prisoner to defend themselves. Prisoners had a few ways to defend themselves, but they weren't always effective. They could call witnesses to speak on their behalf, try to show that the people accusing them had a grudge, or ask for the judges to be replaced if they thought the judges were biased. They could also plead extenuating circumstances, like being drunk or insane when they supposedly committed the crime. One example of how tricky this system was is the case of Diego de Uceda. In 1528, he was accused of being a Lutheran based on a conversation with a stranger. The Inquisition removed all details about the time and place of the conversation, so Diego thought he was being accused of a different conversation he had at Guadarrama. He spent a lot of time trying to prove that the Guadarrama conversation was innocent, but he missed the real evidence against him. He called witnesses to help, but it took 6 months to find them, and even then, their statements didn't help much. Disabling hostile witnesses could sometimes work better. Felipe Leonart, for example, proved in 1637 that his family had accused him out of malice, and he was let off. Gaspar Torralba, from a village near Chinchon, listed 152 people he considered his enemies. Most of the 35 witnesses against him were on that list, so he got off lightly. Pedro Sanchez de Contreras, a magistrate, had detailed records of all his enemies, and when he shared these with the Inquisition, his case was dropped. Recusation, or asking for the judges to be replaced, was a risky move and was rarely tried. One of the few successful cases was that of Carranza, but it didn't help him much in the end. Prisoners also sometimes tried to plead insanity or other extenuating circumstances. For example, Andres Gonzalez, a young man accused of blasphemy, told the Inquisition about his difficult life, including his abusive stepmother and hostile in-laws. The Inquisition felt sorry for him, but still banished him from the area for 3 years. The Inquisition's process wasn't like a modern trial. It was a series of meetings where the prosecution and defense presented their cases, and the prisoner was questioned by the inquisitors in the presence of a notary. When both sides were done, a group called the Consulta de Fe would vote on the case. This group included inquisitors, a representative of the bishop, and experts in theology or law. In some places, like Barcelona, the group also included judges from the royal court and the bishop's court. This meant that verdicts were rarely left to the inquisitors alone. The Valdes Instructions of 1561 said that if the inquisitors and the bishop's representative agreed, their vote would win even if the other experts didn't. If they disagreed, the case would go to the Suprema, the highest body of the Inquisition in Madrid. By the 18th century, the Suprema made all the important decisions, and the local consultas de fe stopped existing. Despite these rules, the system could be unfair. The prisoner's advocate could only draw up articles for the judges to read, and there was no cross-examination. This meant the inquisitors were both the judges and the jury, and the prisoner's fate often depended on their mood. The Inquisition tried to finish cases quickly to save money on keeping prisoners, but sometimes cases dragged on for years. In 1590, the inquisitors in Llerena reported that they had over 60 prisoners, some of whom had been there for up to 7 years. A cleric named Gabriel Escobar was arrested in 1607 and died in prison in 1622 before his trial was over. A Mexican priest, Joseph Brunon de Verdes, was arrested in 1649 and died in prison in 1656, and his trial only finished in 1659, with him being condemned and burnt in effigy. The Inquisition wasn't the only authority in Spain. There were many other courts, like those run by the king, nobles, cities, and the church. Each had its own jurisdiction, and could punish people for different crimes. The Inquisition mainly dealt with heresy, but it also handled some other offenses like sex crimes and sorcery. Its role was to investigate, and if necessary, discipline, not to punish. Punishment was usually handled by other authorities. The Inquisition's activity can be divided into 5 main phases. The intense persecution of conversos from 1480 to about 1520, a quieter early 16th century, a period of activity against Protestants and Moriscos from 1559 to 1614, the 17th century when most cases didn't involve people of Jewish or Moorish origin, and the 18th century when heresy was no longer a major concern. Researchers have tried to count the number of cases the Inquisition handled, but the records are incomplete and often unreliable. The Inquisition's records are the most complete we have from early modern Europe, but they don't show the full picture. Many offenses were never reported or acted upon, and the inquisitors were active in areas not recorded in their official list. The punishments the Inquisition gave could be acquitted: penance, reconciliation, or death. In Valencia, from 1566 to 1609, about 44% of the accused were made to do penance, 40% were reconciled, 2.5% were acquitted, 9% were suspended, 2.1% were burnt in effigy, and 2% were burnt in person. In Galicia, from 1560 to 1700, 18.5% were acquitted, 62.7% were made to do penance, 16.1% were reconciled, 1.9% were burnt in effigy, and 0.7% were burnt in person. In the Canary Islands, from 1504 to 1820, 11 people were burnt in person and 107 in effigy. These numbers show that the Inquisition's impact varied over time and place, but they also highlight the complexities and challenges of the system. The story of the Spanish Inquisition is a complex and often dark chapter in history. While it's true that the number of acquittals was few, it marked a small step forward from the medieval tribunal, which almost never acquitted anyone. In the early days, in 1483 to 85 in Ciudad Real, the inquisitors did set free a few accused, like the converso cobbler Diego Lopez, who was accused of practicing Jewish rituals in secret. The inquisitors declared him free and restored his good name, which was a rare but significant act of mercy. However, outright acquittal was not common because it would mean admitting a mistake, which the Inquisition tried to avoid. Instead, they often suspended cases, leaving the accused under a cloud of suspicion. This meant that the Inquisition could restart the prosecution at any time. Appeals were limited, especially during public autos de fe, where the accused learned their sentences only during the procession, leaving no time to appeal. In private autos, though, there was more room for appeals, which were usually sent to the Suprema, the highest governing body of the Inquisition. Punishments ranged from mild to severe. The least severe was doing penance, where the accused had to publicly renounce their sins. More serious offenders had to wear a penitential garment called the San Benito, which was a yellow robe with crosses, worn as a mark of shame. They could also face fines, banishment, or even time on the galleys, where they would row ships as forced labor. The most serious punishment, short of death, was reconciliation, which involved public penance and often confiscation of property. If someone relapsed after reconciliation, they could be burned at the stake. The San Benito was a particularly degrading punishment. It was a yellow garment with crosses, and those who had to wear it were seen as disgraced. The garment was also sometimes hung in the local church to remind the community of the person's shame. Over time, the Inquisition became more lenient with the San Benito, often shortening the required wearing time. Prison sentences were also common, but they were not always as harsh as they might seem. Some prisoners were allowed to serve their time in their own homes, or in comfortable institutions like convents or hospitals. This was partly because the Inquisition often lacked prison space. Important people, like the Admiral of Aragon or Archbishop Carranza, were usually placed under house arrest rather than sent to a prison cell. One of the most feared punishments was the galleys. Condemned people were forced to row warships, a grueling and dehumanizing task. This punishment became more common in the mid-16th century as the Spanish Navy expanded. Unlike other courts, which might sentence people to life on the galleys, the Inquisition usually limited the sentence to a few years. Flogging was another common punishment. The accused would be whipped through the streets, often stripped to the waist and riding an ass for added humiliation. This was a severe and degrading punishment, and even very young or very old people could be subjected to it. Despite its cruelty, flogging was a traditional form of punishment in Christian society. The ultimate punishment was death by burning at the stake. This was reserved for unrepentant heretics or those who had relapsed after being pardoned. The Inquisition did not carry out the execution itself. Instead, it handed the condemned over to secular authorities who carried out the sentence. Many of those sentenced to death were burned in effigy, either because they had died or fled. While the Inquisition has a reputation for being a bloodthirsty institution, the actual number of executions was relatively low. Over its entire history, it is estimated that no more than 5,000 people were executed for heresy. This is a small number compared to the total number of cases handled by the Inquisition. In many regions, the execution rate was less than 2% of the accused. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the Inquisition executed fewer people per year than most other courts in Spain or Europe. The auto de fe, the public ceremony where sentences were announced, evolved over time. In the early days, it was a simple and efficient process focused on reconciling large numbers of heretics. By the later years, it had become a more elaborate and dramatic event, designed to instill fear and reinforce the power of the Inquisition. In the end, the Spanish Inquisition was a product of its time, shaped by the religious and social tensions of the era. While it was undoubtedly a harsh and often cruel institution, it was not the relentless and bloodthirsty monster that some historical accounts have portrayed. Understanding its complexities and the context in which it operated helps us to see it more clearly for what it was: a reflection of the fears and beliefs of a bygone era.